Hi, everybody. Anyway, it's 250 days since the war in Gaza and the attacks of October 7th. And so I am having a conversation with Shayndi Raice. Sorry, Shayndi, thank you for your patience. You were saying that the feeling of in Israel after the hostage rescue was one of jubilation, sort of a renewed confidence in the IDF and their capabilities. And I'm curious how the four hostages are doing, if they've had any contact with the media.
They haven't had contact with the media. We at the Wall Street Journal have spoken to some relatives of theirs to hear a little bit about how they're doing. There's also been some reports in local Israeli media. So the initial response was, they came out on their own feet. And so I think a lot of people were amazed by that and thought that that meant that they were in really good shape. We've heard in recent days from the doctors that treated them that there was a lot of adrenaline running through their bodies, sort of helping them get through that moment. And the doctors said that, they were beaten a lot and hadn't seen sunlight for about something like 8 months. You could see their faces were very white, and they'd endured psychological torture, and they all had severe malnutrition. So it's obviously been very difficult for them, and it's going to be a really, really long road to recovery. We don't have a ton of details about their time in captivity. I mean, one thing that came out that was pretty interesting that we do know is that the 3 men who were rescued were held by a journalist, somebody who worked for the Palestine Chronicle, which is a local publication. So apparently he also had some role as a spokesperson for Hamas, and the IDF put that out, but we also, in our coverage, were able to confirm that the hostages ID'd him as well.
Got it.
So, yeah.
That's strange.
Yeah, well, it's one of the, arguments that the Israelis make is that in a place like Gaza, the distinctions between journalist and Hamas and government official are very blurred. It's obviously not a free society. It's an authoritative society. Something it feels like maybe people don't realize. And so there isn't freedom of the press the way that we would think of it. And so you don't necessarily have that distinction between somebody who is a spokesperson for Hamas at the same time being a journalist. But yes, that came out, and more will come out. I mean, it takes time for the hostages to speak, but in my experience, they do eventually talk to the press. Not all of them, but we've spoken to a lot of them, and especially in the Israeli media, there have been very, very extensive interviews with a lot of former hostages.
I have to, of course, ask you about the aftermath of the rescue operation, because that was obviously getting a lot of attention. What is your understanding of the death toll? I've heard various reports. The IDF is reporting about fewer than 100 civilians were killed, local health officials in Gaza, and of course, there's been a lot of scrutiny and discrepancies in some of these numbers that have been reported, but local health officials say as many as 274 people were killed in the process of this rescue operation. Either way, it is clearly a devastating number. What has the reaction been in Israel about the aftermath and the information about casualties during this rescue?
Yeah, well, like most things, there's kind of a different view in Israel from the view that the rest of the world has. One of the best stories I think we wrote was sort of this split screen between what the rest of the world sees and what Israel sees, especially on the nightly news. And obviously, people were really shocked by the high death toll. We obviously don't know of the 274 how many were militants and how many were civilians. The IDF said about 100 people were killed, mostly militants. It's very hard to know. There obviously were videos, some horrific videos, which I saw of young children who were killed that were just, absolutely horrific, and images, you can't get out of your head. So it had a very high cost in human life for Palestinians. That's undeniable. I think that there's sections of the parts of the world that see that death toll and think that the Israelis shouldn't have done it if they knew that the death toll among Palestinian civilians were going to be so high. I think that Israel feels that it has a moral duty to rescue its hostages, and that the government would also say, or the army would say, that they tried to minimize civilian casualties. It's hard to know really how hard they tried or to what extent. What we do know is that they faced tremendous resistance from Hamas as they tried to rescue the hostages. And so there were a couple of things that were happening at the same time. So while they had these groups of soldiers that were going in to take the hostages out, they also hit several Hamas targets. And the idea of that was to create a sense of confusion, and kind of what they call it is like a ring of fire, so that you sort of you create this ring of fire around the soldiers who are coming in to extract the hostages. So there were some people who were, collateral deaths in that, as they targeted the Hamas militants when they went in. But then as they tried to leave, and when Hamas figured out what was happening, they came in and there was heavy fire directed at the Israelis, who were in the middle of, a very packed, dense neighborhood. There's a market there. And so they were firing at the Israelis, and they were also shooting RPGs at them. So the Israelis had to send in rescue crews to take out the hostages. We wrote a TikTok of the rescue effort, and if you read it, you'll see that the rescue team that went in to rescue the hostages ended up needing a rescue team to rescue them, who needed a rescue team to rescue them. So there was this was an incredibly complicated operation that faced significant resistance when it went there, when the Israelis went in. So I think that the civilian deaths are obviously horrific. We don't actually know who to say is responsible for the most civilian deaths. I mean, these are two enemies that are fighting against each other in dense civilian territory. And, it's just incredibly tragic.
The last time we spoke, Shayndi, you were talking about the growing frustration among the hostage families in Israel who were staging protests and demonstrations. Can you give us an update on hostage families? Because there's still, gosh, how many people continue to remain hostages?
116, and many of those are dead. It's the issue here that's dividing the country, that's sort of ripping people apart, and it's obviously one of the most painful ongoing realities in this country, and it's ripping apart the government. It's ripping apart society, families. I mean, there is obviously a large segment of the country that thinks that the war needs to continue at any cost. There are people who think the hostages were dead the minute they were kidnapped, and the army has to fight as if there are no hostages. And there are obviously a lot of people who think that the government's primary responsibility should be to saving those people's lives, that they let those people down by not protecting them. And if it means doing whatever Hamas wants, they need to give into it, even if it means losing the war, ending the war. And so that is, the issue here right now. I think the biggest problem is that, we can get into it also, but it doesn't seem that Hamas wants to accept a deal. And so, the people here who want Israel to give Hamas everything they want, I mean, you also need to have a partner on the other side who's willing to release those hostages in exchange for what's wanted.
Shayndi, you were saying that most of the hostages are believed to be dead.
Not most, but a lot of them.
Oh, I thought I misunderstood, because I wondered if you could give us what intelligence is saying about, or if they even have any idea about the condition of the people who are still being held.
So of the 116 that I mentioned, that those include bodies, Israel has actually released, I think it's something like 35 names of people they have intelligence on that are definitely dead.
Yes, I
Yeah,
saw that there were some older gentlemen, one,
exactly.
at least three older gentlemen, one who was less old, who
Yeah.
were, I think that was just about 3 or 4 days ago. It came out that they had in fact died. But what about some of the other people? You were saying they're 30 something
So
who are believed to be dead?
the IDF actually puts out names when they have intelligence that someone is dead, and they have a special committee that determines when there's sufficient intelligence. So I believe they've released something like 35 names in total. I have to check on the latest with, adding up the new
Right.
names mentioned. Beyond that, there are probably significantly more who are dead. This committee is really, really careful to make sure that they only declare someone dead when they have 100% positivity that someone is dead. I don't know exactly what that intelligence means, but I would imagine it could be either DNA evidence that they've found. I know, for example, with one hostage, Shani Look, they had found like a part of her skull that
Mm.
they knew that she couldn't have been alive anymore, without that part of her body. So, I mean, they have significant intelligence. I'm sure they also have video evidence. Remember, as they go in, they're often raiding and taking over Hamas intelligence. They found server farms with tremendous amounts of footage and intelligence. So that's what they know. Now, the problem is that there are probably many who are also dead that they have not said are dead because they won't say it unless they have 100% intelligence. The estimates of how many are left alive, I mean, it really ranges, but the numbers, you know, are probably not that good. We don't know for sure.
So
But I would say that of the 35 that have been declared dead, you can assume that there are another number that on top of that are also dead.
So I mean, I'm sure you've been in touch with these families. I know I've interviewed
Yeah.
many of them. Um, Gosh, how are they, I don't want to say how are they doing because it's obvious, but how are they managing the situation? And there still is hope that some of these people could be alive. Those four who were rescued were still alive. I'm assuming that they're continuing to be hopeful.
Yeah, I think a lot of families are trying to be hopeful. I know you've interviewed Rachel and John, Hirsch Goldberg Poland's mother and father, and they obviously have dedicated their life now to trying to free their son, and that's where they put all their energy.
And we
Uh,
should just remind people who are watching, Shayndi, that Hirsch was the young man who was, I guess, in a shelter, and the Hamas terrorists were throwing in hand grenades and they were throwing them out. And during that process, he lost his arm.
yeah, yeah, he did, and he's also an American citizen. And there was a hostage video of him a number of weeks ago, and he was missing his arm, but it looked like he had surgery of some sort, and it had healed. I'm sure for his family that was a tremendous relief to see that he was still alive, but also, to see the condition that he was in. He wasn't. He looked horrible, and it was a very hard video to watch. And so I think that, there are a lot of families who are just suffering, but here, the families are just constantly protesting. We have these nightly protests in Tel Aviv every Saturday night, pretty much. The families lead these large protests. Tens of thousands of people go out. So they really dedicated themselves to fighting for a deal, fighting and pushing, trying to pressure the government to make a deal with Hamas to free the rest of the hostages. I think one thing that the families said after the rescue operation is that, as happy as we are that these people were rescued by the IDF, the reality is that the rest of the hostages are not going to come home in any sort of rescue operation. These hostages were kept above ground. I think the hostages who are kept below ground are going to be really hard, if not impossible, to rescue. Hamas has the complete advantage there. And, Hamas has given orders that if there's any attempt to rescue hostages, the hostages should be killed immediately. So the IDF it's not going to be able to save everyone through these rescue operations. And so I think that the families of the hostages really want to get that idea through to the government that the best way to bring these people home is going to be through a deal.
And we'll talk about the deal in a moment, but before we do, I wanted to ask you about Benny Gantz, the retired general who was part of the Emergency Wartime Coalition. He quit on Sunday. He had said he would quit if, I believe, well, you can help me understand this, that Netanyahu, if he didn't come up with some kind of plan for after the war, that he would quit. So tell me how significant this is and what it does to Benjamin Netanyahu's standing in the country.
So the immediate fallout is very limited in the sense that Netanyahu still has a majority. There are 120 seats in the parliament and he has 64. So nothing's happening with his government. The question is now he has a very thin majority and all it takes would be 5 defectors to topple him. Are there 5 defectors either from his own party or from another party that would potentially bring down the government? That is really the million-dollar question in Israel right now. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of the reason that Benny Gantz has waited this long to leave the government is probably because, he didn't know if he would leave and he would just be out of a position of power. I mean, when he was in the government, he was in this 3-member war cabinet. He had a very important vote. But the reports have been that he's felt increasingly sidelined. Netanyahu does things without his approval, without his knowledge. And so he felt he was becoming really less and less influential. And on top of that, this issue of coming up with a post-war plan for Gaza has really been one of the primary strategic problems that Israel is facing right now. Netanyahu is under tremendous pressure to come up with a plan. He doesn't want to come up with a plan. The reason he doesn't want to come up with a plan, or at least what people allege the reason is that he doesn't want to come up with a plan, is because any plan would probably make some part of his coalition angry and could collapse the government. And so he's sort of trying to not say what comes next to kind of keep everybody happy.
So I know that the AP reported the rescue might help rehabilitate Netanyahu's image. In the country as a whole, how is Netanyahu being viewed right now?
He still would not win if elections were held today. He wouldn't be the prime minister, but he has seen not only that sort of the bloodletting has stopped, but he's very slightly gained in the polls. So I think that his plan is the longer he can wait, the better the situation will be. He knows there's probably going to have to be new elections at some point. And there are certain technical things that will probably make that happen. Most people think a year from now. But his strategy, it seems, is the longer he can hold on, the better the chances are that his standing in the polls recuperates. And so for the opposition, it's really important that they try to take him down the soonest that they possibly can before he has a chance to recuperate. I'm sure that the hostage rescue has given him a little bit of a boost. I don't know if it's sort of made everything better. Obviously, there's still 116 people who are hostage, and the country is still sort of torn apart and, very upset about the aftermath of October 7th. I think that where we have seen the politics shifting slightly is in favor of Benny Gantz. So right after October 7th, it was clear that he had tremendous support. Pretty much all the people who were, disillusioned by Netanyahu were going to Gantz to support him. What we've seen over the last 8 months, and especially over the last few months, is that he is losing support, not to Netanyahu, but to other centrist parties or other right-wing parties. And so what you would probably see if Netanyahu were to lose power within the next year would be a center-right government. So a right-wing government, maybe a little bit more center-right, but not a Netanyahu government.
Let's talk about negotiations that are ongoing as we speak over a proposed ceasefire and hostage release. The New York Times reported just moments ago that both sides are very far apart. Tony Blinken is in Qatar right now trying to move this forward. It seems to be in three phases. What can you tell us about the latest on these negotiations, Shayndi?
So the latest is a little bit strange. Biden has, for the last week or so, 2 weeks about, been going out and saying he has a proposal that has been agreed upon by the Israelis. And that's this three-stage deal. The first stage, there's a cessation of hostilities. A number of hostages get released, not most of them, but some of them. And that's a 6-week
And
period. Palestinians
I
are,
think and Palestinian prisoners would be released at the
yes,
same time.
that's right, exactly. In exchange for the hostages, Palestinian prisoners would be released. Other Palestinians would be allowed to go home. The Israeli troops would pull back. Where it gets really sticky is in that next phase. So what Hamas wants is they want concrete promise that the war will be over. And the Biden proposal says that there will be a negotiation at that stage over the end of the war. And Israel has not publicly embraced the Biden proposal, but they have put out statements. There have been Israeli officials who put out statements saying that the proposal enables Israel to achieve all its war goals. So it seems like the Israelis do accept that proposal. There's a lot of sort of game playing going on. It seems on the part of the Israelis, they haven't like publicly come forward and say, yes, we embrace this proposal, but yes, they embrace the proposal.
So how often, but then Hamas keeps actually putting more conditions out,
Right.
and it seems like they're at loggerheads right now in terms of making real progress. Are you optimistic? I know that part of the sticking point is phase two because Israel, they want a cessation of the military action, but Israel doesn't want that until they're convinced that they have eradicated Hamas. So it's,
Yeah.
it's a very difficult situation. Do you think they'll be able to iron out these differences, or this will be another failed plan?
It doesn't look like it's going in a good direction. I think that my understanding, and at least the way the Americans have described it and the way Blinken has described it, is that Hamas continues to add new demands, things that they previously agreed to. They've now said that they won't agree to. And so that's where we are. I think that, I guess one thing I would keep in mind is, Hamas really, they feel Sinwar. Okay, so let me just go back a step. So Yahya Sinwar is the military leader of Hamas based in Gaza.
And he's the one who said recently, we have Israel just where we want them.
Exactly, yeah. So we got our hands on some messages from Sinwar and we published it, and that's exactly what he said. And so I think that if you look at those messages, and more if you look at his strategy, it just, from their perspective, they really have no reason to agree to a hostage deal. And the reason why is because the more death and destruction in Gaza, they believe the more it helps their position. They think that they don't need to give up any hostages in order for Israel to stop the war. What they want is Israel to stop the war, leave them in power, and let them, continue to rule Gaza and continue and rebuild and fight Israel again. They can do that as long as the world puts pressure on Israel and demands a ceasefire without a hostage deal. And so that seems to be Sinwar's position. I don't know that everyone in Hamas has that same position. There's a political branch of Hamas that's located in Doha in Qatar, and they seem to have a different view. I think they probably would be more likely to want a deal. But the reality is that Sinwar is the person who has the last say, and he has the hostages under his control. He's probably got a bunch of them sitting right around him. And so if he doesn't want a deal, there's not going to be a deal.
How are people in Israel? I know obviously it's not a monolith, but in closing, how are people feeling about they've received a lot of international condemnation, right, on how this war has been executed, the number of civilian casualties, and that number again has been subject to a lot of analysis and scrutiny and skepticism. But having said that, I know it's a very, you started this conversation, I think, before we had to sign off because of the comment issue, that there is a way Israel sees this situation and the rest of the world sees this situation. Um, what is the current mindset of Israelis right now? I know it's very fragmented, as you said, but is the international pressure start having any impact on the Israeli people?
I think that there are a few things that there are ways that Israel does feel the pressure, and then there are ways that they don't. I would say that there are a lot of Israelis who really don't like the stance that Netanyahu has taken towards Biden. There's a segment of Israelis, usually people who are more in the center left camp, who think that America is Israel's greatest friend, and American president deserves a certain deference and respect. And if America tells you they want you to do this or they want you to do that, you should listen. And they feel that Netanyahu has been too defiant, not listening to the Americans, not taking them seriously. So I definitely think there is a segment of the population that is not happy with the way Netanyahu has managed the Biden-America relationship. Putting that aside, in terms of the cases against Israel at the International Court of Justice, the arrest warrants that were made, or that were requested by the chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. I think most Israelis, the overwhelming majority, see it as anti-Semitism. They think the world has lost their minds. They see this as a war of pure self-defense, and they don't understand at all how they have become the bad guys when they so clearly are the victim. And you meet Israelis, secular, religious, on the right, on the left. I think that most people feel that way. There is, of course, a segment of Israelis, including Israeli Arabs, who are, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who feel differently, who feel that, I'm sure, the polls clearly show that many of them support the war, but I think they also want a ceasefire at this point. They think Israel has, been too aggressive in its military campaign in Gaza. You also have a lot of people on the far left in Israel who want a ceasefire, who want an end to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. There is sort of a far left that makes itself heard. They are at these protests I was talking about that happen on Saturday nights. There's an anti-war contingent that's always there. But, what always strikes me is how small that contingent is. It's probably 50 people. They're really loud. They have drums, and every time I'm covering one of these protests, I see them. But then, the rest of the protests are just people with, seas of blue and white flags. And it's a sharp contrast. So people here, yeah, they really are sort of scratching their heads. They're angry, and they see a lot of it as anti-Semitism.
Shayndi Raice, I'm so happy to see you again, not in the staircase of your building as was the case when we first met. Shayndi Raice is covering this for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for the update, and we really appreciate your time. I know it's probably getting late there, and you have kids, so I'm going to let you go. But thanks again, Shayndi.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's a pleasure.
All right, talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye.